This is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing with the last couple sections of Individuation, Volume 2. So we're on the text Allagmatics. So that we started this last time, and I think should finish it today. So Allagmatics is Simondon's invented term for his idea of a science of operations. So he takes it that science in its sort of general usage, when we talk about astronomy or physics or biology or whatever, these are all sciences of structure. So they're about what kinds of things there are, how things are constructed or made up, or what they're made of. And he takes it that this is only sort of one half of of what science could be, or of what science should be. So he thinks there should be another science, or another kind of science, which would be a science of operations. And he takes it that cybernetics is sort of the first step towards this kind of science of operations. So cybernetics is not a science of a particular kind of entity, a kind of structure. It's not a science of living beings or of technical objects or whatever. It's a science that looks at various forms of operation. And in particular, it focuses on the operation, the group of operations, or the set of operations that is characterized by feedback. Where you have some sort of operation, and then the result of that operation feeds back into the operating of that operation itself. So the sort of stock example that is often used is a thermostat. So you have a thermostat, you set it to a certain temperature, and then if the temperature falls below that, if the temperature in the room falls below the temperature that you've set on your thermostat, it turns on a heater, and then the heater heats up the room above the temperature that you set on the thermostat, and then the thermostat shuts off the heater. So the operation of the thermostat to turn on the heater changes the temperature, which has the effect of removing the condition that triggered the action in the first place. So this is an example of a feedback operation, a negative feedback operation. You can also have positive feedback operations. And so Simondon, as we'll see, I think later in this text, he thinks that cybernetics is sort of too limited in the sense that it focuses on this feedback operation and not on, it doesn't sort of have a general concept of operations, or it doesn't look at other types of operations that are not structured in this feedback way. But he does think it's a sort of a first step towards this science of operations. And so this is what Allagmatics is that science of operations that would be a more general form of what cybernetics has started doing. And then we also saw in the little bit that we read how Simondon sees this the relationship between structure and operation, and he takes the example of the cogito in Descartes. So the cogito has these sort of two sides, in the sense that it's on the one hand, it's an operation, it's something that the mind does. But then the other aspect, or the other side of the cogito, is that it's a sort of entity. It has a certain structure, and we can connect this to some of the content in Volume 2 that Volume 1 of Individuation, where he talks about the cogito, and he talks about doubting doubt and doubted doubt, these sort of two sides of the intellectual operation of doubt. So in the cogito, you have this act of thinking I exist, and this act of thinking is immediately sort of transformed into an object of thought. So you have this act I exist, this act of thinking I exist, which is true whenever I think it. But as soon as I stop thinking it, or if I think of something else, and then I sort of recall my past act of thinking I exist, then that thought is now an object of thought. It's not my thinking itself. It's something that I'm thinking about, and then now it's something that can sort of be called into doubt. I can I can ask, is it the case that I just think that I had this thought 5 minutes ago, and I'm subject to illusion because of the evil genius or evil demon that is making me think that I had the thought I exist 5 minutes ago. Uh, so this sort of passage from the act to the or from the operation to the structure, from this act of thinking to the um, entity that is a thought. This is sort of the type of relationship that Simondon sees between operation and structure in general, and so the cogito is a sort of instance of this duality of operation and structure. Okay, so let's continue with the text. So we were on page 664 of the PDF. So I will read the next page or so, and then we'll discuss. Postulate of equivalence. An operation is equivalent with an operation, or an operation is equivalent with a structure when they each involve a transoperative rapport or a rapport of conversion with a third operation or structure. Definition. Analogy is a transoperative equivalence. Definition. Modulation and demodulation are equivalences of operation and structure. Modulation is the transformation of an energy into structure, and demodulation is the transformation of a structure into energy. In that case, the structure is a signal. We cannot determine in advance if the relation between two operations passes through the intermediary of a structure, or if this relation is direct but supposes a structure of putting into relation. Nevertheless, according to the postulate we have posited, analogy and the analogical act would be different from modulation, which puts an operation and a structure into relation. We will suppose that the relation of modulation defines the application of a structure to an operation through the intermediary of a state that is the mitaxu, or middle ground, between the operation and the structure, i.e. energy. In modulation, we must distinguish between the veritable structure, which is the structure of the signal or form, and the structure that puts form and energy into relation. The operation is this putting into relation, or rather a condition of this putting into relation. For the putting into relation of an operation and a structure is an act which supposes operation as energy and structure by way of form, which is also called signal. The analogical act is the putting into relation of two operations, whether directly or by way of structures, while the act of modulation is the putting into relation of the operation and the structure through an active ensemble called the modulator. All operations are aspects of the act of modulation or of the analogical act, or they are combinations of the act of modulation and the analogical act. I'll stop here because we have a section heading. So yeah, this bit is fairly dense. So we can maybe start by going back to some of the definitions that he introduced in the last bit that we read last time. So he talks about the different types of sort of constructions you can build in terms of relationships between operations and structures. So you can have a relationship of an operation to an operation, which he calls a transoperative operation. A transoperative rapport or relationship. And then you can also have a rapport between an operation and a structure, which is what he calls a conversion. And he, on the basis of this, of these two definitions or these two concepts, he introduces what he calls here the postulate of equivalence. So it's the idea that there's a sort of equivalence of two operations with each other, or of an operation and a structure. So you can either have an operation as equivalent to an operation, or you can have an operation is equivalent to a structure. And this is the case when there's a rapport to a third operation or structure. So he leaves this condition, I think, a little bit vague, but I think the idea is sort of that you can pass from. So if you have an operation A and an operation B, for example, and you want to say these two operations are equivalent, to do that you have to look at a third operation C and show that you can sort of go in any direction between them. So this is actually, if anyone is familiar with category theory, this is a sort of a commutative diagram type of operation. So the idea is if you go from A to B and B to C, it's the same thing as going from A to C. Those composed operations are the same as the composite operation. I think that's the type of relationship that he has in mind here, so that you can this third operation that you have to use to compare the two initial operations is has to do with the commutativity of that relationship between the operations. So this is the postulate of equivalence, and then he, on the basis of this postulate, he gives a definition of analogy. He says it's a transoperative equivalence. So this would be an equivalence between operations. So you have an operation A and operation B are equivalent. So there's another operation C such that they all sort of line up properly in the way that you would expect. And that's what analogy is. And so this is an important suggestion because, as we saw in volume 1, analogy is one of the key concepts of Simondon's whole sort of philosophical framework. He describes transduction, the transductive method, as what is valid about analogy. So it's sort of stripping away the invalid aspects of analogy and sticking to what is valid about analogy. And so analogy is a key concept for Simondon, and here he's trying to give this very abstract, I guess, sort of structural definition of what analogy is. So it's an equivalence between operations. And then he also goes on to talk about modulation and demodulation. So these are sort of inverse operations or inverse equivalences to each other. So a modulation is an equivalence of operation and structure, and a demodulation is likewise an equivalence, but in the opposite direction. So it has to do, so modulation in the sort of general sense of the term has to do with if you have like a signal of some kind, like a radio wave, you can modulate that signal by imposing some sort of variation on the signal. So it can be frequency modulation or amplitude modulation are the two sort of standard forms in radio transmission. So you have a radio wave that has a certain frequency, and then you have a modulation that varies that frequency in such a way that it transmits information. And so this is sort of, and then at the receiver end, there's some sort of apparatus that can receive the signal, the modulation of the radio wave, and transform that into a sound output, which is again just a modulation of waves in the air. So modulation is imposing a sort of structure onto something, another sort of stream of energy, or a pattern, imposing a pattern on some sort of energetic transmission. And so this is one form of equivalence of operation and structure. And then the opposite one would be a demodulation. So if you start from a modulated signal and then transform it into something that is not modulated. So you take a radio wave with its modulation, and then you turn it back into just a plain radio wave that is not modulated. So that would be a demodulation. And so so these are the sort of two opposite directions you can go between an operation and a structure. So those are sort of the sets of concepts that Simondon is developing here. So he's trying to give a very abstract characterization of some of the central concepts that he had already used in volume 1 of this work.
Oh, I have questions. The very first one is like under the title of Allagmatics. Does this show like the how do I say, more theoretical? I mean, the specific explanation of the process of individuation, like thinking about psychic individuation, like and collective individuation. We don't know exactly what kind of a process is like. I mean, in terms of transduction or something like that. And then through introducing the idea of analogy or modulation and demodulation and so on and so on, Simon is trying to more visualize, like, or specify, elaborate, like the process. And that is the first question. And then the second one is like, at the end of your reading, is there any difference between the structure, the vector structure, and then which is the structure of the signal or form? So, is there any difference between structure and form? And then the final question is like thinking the whole thing, like, then as far as I understand, allagmatics is the concept, like Simon is trying to explain, like the at the end of the day, like the process of individuation, which as far as I understood, like the process of virtual potential, how to actualize virtual potential. And if that is right, then the allagmatics, the whole thing is that, like, trying to make everything similar. Like, trying to find something overlap. And by doing that, like to make the to transform, transfer or transmit, whatever, and then to structure to energy to structure. The key point is that to trying to find something similar and not that different. That's all. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of different points in your questions there. Maybe I'll start with sort of explaining what relationship I see between this text and Individuation Volume 1, or the Individuation book itself. Because I think in this text he's not so much looking at individuation as such. He's, I think, trying to go to, I guess, a higher level of abstraction. So in Individuation, he looks at particular models, I guess, of individuation, or particular instances of individuation, physical, vital, psychical, etc. And then he sort of abstracts a schema of what individuation is from each of these forms of individuation. Whereas here, I think he's taking that sort of schema of individuation as a starting point, and then trying to abstract from that schema itself and get to a higher level of abstraction. So we're not even thinking about specific kinds of individuation anymore. We're looking at these very general ontological principles, I guess you can say, like structure and operation as such, and what are the kinds of relationships that can hold between structures and operations. And we're not even thinking yet about which specific structures or which specific operations might sort of instantiate these kinds of relationships. So I think the overall strategy is at some point we need to sort of redescend to concrete instances, but the idea is that we sort of ascend to this very abstract sort of level of discourse, and then that allows us to sort of transform our understanding of the more concrete level of discourse that we found in Individuation. So I think that's the sort of overall strategy of this text. So it's not dealing specifically with individuation anymore. It's dealing with these very abstract concepts of operation and structure. So this text, I think, is more ontological than most of Individuation Volume 1 was. It's at a level of much higher abstraction, and yeah, so that it does make it in some ways more difficult to follow, but it's also more simple in a sense. Each of these principles is one sort of simple principle that is being put into relation with other principles, and we have to sort of grasp it in its simplicity and not sort of import other content into it than what he's introducing in his definitions here. Yeah, so I don't think that exactly answers your questions, but I think that's sort of how I see the relationship between this text and individuation. So this text is sort of like, well, maybe to reverse the metaphor. So is you can think of it as sort of ascending into a higher level of abstraction, or you can think of it as sort of digging below the foundations of volume one as well. So either ascending or descending, depending on which sort of order of the metaphor you want to use. But in either direction, it's sort of going beyond the content of volume one and trying to provide a sort of explanatory framework that will set that content of volume one into a different context.
Yeah. That's good explanation. Thank you. Then, just like going back to the last question, then the purpose is like here, like analogy and whole thing. The idea is like aims to get the similar, like analogical, or finding something overlapped between things. That's the like the core idea of this process.
Yeah, I'm not sure if similar is exactly the right word, because similar, when we talk about similarity, we're thinking of, say, that if we want to say that, I don't know, dogs and wolves are similar, then we would say that, dogs have properties A, B, C, D, and wolves have properties A, B, C, E. And so they share, there's like a shared set of properties that they all have together, that they have in common. Um, um, and so I think he would want to separate what he's doing from sort of a search for similarities or resemblances. And yeah, so as Angus points out, that he does distinguish analogy from resemblance later on in this text.
Oh.
And I think analogy, in contrast to similarity or resemblance, is not about shared properties, but it's a sort of shared structure of operations and structures. So analogy has to do with so within an entity, there's some sort of complex network of operations and structures that make up what that entity is, and then we can sort of take that complex network and sort of map it onto the complex network that makes up another entity, and sort of compare those two structures. And so it's that operation that constitutes analogy. So you're not just looking at the properties of objects, you're looking at the structures that make up the being of those objects, the structures and operations, I should say. And so analogy is a more abstract operation than just sort of comparing two entities and seeing what they have in common. And it's more abstract, and it's also more it requires more intellectual activity. So it's not just a sort of passive recognition that property A is common to dogs and wolves, but you actually have to look at what is the structure of a dog. How is it? What sort of operations and structures make up the being of a dog, and then see if you can make an analogy with. It might be something that is not similar to a dog at all. It might be a car or something like that. You might find some sort of analogy with something very different from a dog. And so, yeah, analogy is more abstract and it requires more sort of intellectual activity than sort of recognizing resemblances.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you.
One thing that I noticed when I reread this earlier today is that it sort of seems like in the beginning the focus is on operation. I know that also from the beginning, operation is sort of inseparable from structure, but at least the idea of the transoperative is, I think, a comparison of operations. And then a little bit later on, he'll say something like, this theory of knowledge presupposes an ontology, and this ontology is that there's no difference between what something is and what it does. And that it would be difficult to know if there was a combination of operation and structure. But then he goes on to sort of denigrate Bergson for only thinking operation. And so I'm just trying to figure out or I want to, I guess, figure out as we go through this what the proper emphasis on operation is, and why he sometimes seems to sort of emphasize operation to the exclusion of structure, and sometimes seems to say that the knowledge of both is needed.
Yeah, I think that's a good question to sort of keep in mind as we read through this text. So I won't sort of give a complete answer, I don't think, at this point. But one thing I would say is that I think the sort of emphasis on operation that we see at the beginning of the text is because for Simondon, he thinks that operation has only just started to be recognized by science in the field of cybernetics. So he thinks that science, as it's developed since, say, Galileo, has been focused on structures and has sort of neglected operations. And so he wants to sort of, rebalance science so that it would turn its attention to operations instead. So you need to sort of focus more attention on operations. But then he ultimately doesn't want to see operations as something completely disjoint from structures, and so he is going to criticize Bergson for introducing this kind of dualism between operations and structures, and so he wants to have so the cogito that I talked about in the introduction is sort of his model for this sort of immediate convertibility between operations and structures. That there's never an operation without a structure or a structure without an operation. They're always sort of immediately bound up with each other, and so it's this sort of connection between the two, or not even connection, but immediate bindingness, I guess, or bond between operation and structure that Simondon wants to take as the sort of fundamental principle. And then so the focus on operation is sort of provisional in the sense that it's sort of redressing the balance of the focus of attention by science in the last couple hundred years. But the ultimate goal is to have a sort of unified science that would be a science of operation and structure together.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I can read from the next section if we're ready to move on.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So yeah, you can read a page or so.
Theory of the analogical act. The analogical act is the relating of two operations. Plato used the analogical act as a logical method of inductive discovery. Paradigmatism consists in transporting an operation of thought, an operation which is first tested on a particular known structure, for example, that which serves in the sophist to define the angler, and imparted to another particular unknown structure and object of research, the structure of the sophist and the sophist. This act of thought, the transfer of operations, does not suppose the existence of an ontological ground common to the fisherman and the sophist, to the aspeleutic and the sophistical. In no way does it seek to prove that the fisherman and the sophist result from the imitation of the same shared model through the demiurge. Logical paradigmatism is freed from metaphysical exemplarism. Transfer of the operation is validated by an identity of real operative rapport in the exercise of the aspeleutic and in the exercise of the sophistical. If the operations of the fisherman and the sophist are inscribed, and the terms between which these operations unfold are erased, one can abstract from the specification of the system of terms designating the fisherman's conditions of operation or the sophist's conditions of operation. The series of terms that constitutes the sophistical is replaced term for term with the series of terms that constitutes the aspeleutic. Angler replaces sophist, and fish replaces rich young people, whereas the operations between these terms remain in full. The operation of seduction and then the operation of profitable capture are the same in the two series. All the intrinsic characteristics of these terms themselves are exempt in the analogical act. And this abstraction, this independence of operations with respect to the terms, is what gives the analogical method its universality. since the consideration of the terms does not change anything in the nature of the operations, one can pass from the large to the small or the small to the large. Such is the method used to define man starting with the city, because the larger logical model is easier to grasp. This method is similar to the one that mathematicians use, which is known as the rule of proportionality. The first operation, quotient of the first pair of terms, A over B, is transferred to the second pair of terms, B over C, or BC. And given B allows us to calculate C. But in the Platonic analogical method, not only the operation of measure, but every type of operation is transferred. There are a few things that are still obscure about this to me. That first line about the relating of two operations, it seems like relation in Allagmatics is much broader than operation, because relation can be the relation between an operation and a structure, and also the relation between two operations. And then the idea that there isn't an ontological ground common to the fisherman and the sophist. I guess I've been thinking of Simondon recently as kind of a univocal thinker in this, the idea that the operations for these very different structures or activities can be compared would seem to commit him to a kind of univocity of operation, or the idea that once you eliminate the terms from an operation, it can be applied to any sufficiently similar operation, no matter what entity or entities are carrying out that operation. So it was surprising, and I think he makes a similar point later on, to see the statement that there isn't a common ground of being between the structures that are being compared in the analogical act.
Yeah, I think those are both good points. So yeah, I think you're right that sorry. I think you're right that relation is broader than either operation or structure, because we're looking at relations between operations or between operations and structures. So relation is maybe the sort of overarching term here, that he doesn't actually give us a definition of relation or rapport in this text, but his sort of ontological system, as he sets it out in Individuation, is supposed to be a system in which relation has the status of being. And so I think that principle is at work here as well. So if we start from the assumption or the axiom that relation has the status of being, then we can look at relations between operations or between operations and structures as sort of as having their own ontological status, as being parts of reality or aspects of reality. I think the second bit, I think he's maybe making a somewhat more limited claim. He's not saying that there's no sort of ontological basis for that sort of legitimizes this operation, or this active analogy that's passing from the angler to the sophist, for example. What he's suggesting here is that we don't need to presuppose some sort of common basis. Like, for example, in the sort of Platonic image, we don't need to suppose that the angler and the sophist are produced on the basis of the same idea, the same form. We don't need to say that there's some sort of common form that brings about the being of the angler and of the sophist. So it's I think a more limited claim in that sense. So it doesn't mean necessarily that there's nothing about like the ontological structure of the world that allows for us to sort of perform this active analogy. It's just that there's no sort of common principle that brings about the being of the angler and the being of the sophist that would legitimize the analogical act. And so I think I think this is what he means here when he says that logical paradigmatism is freed from metaphysical exemplarism. So the idea is that we can use analogies to understand something unknown on the basis of something known without having to presuppose that there's some sort of common form that each of those two entities exemplarizes or instantiates. And so in the case of the angler and the sophist, for example, I mean, in the dialogue, the sophists, these analogies are proposed, I think, in a somewhat comical manner. I don't know exactly how seriously we're meant to take them, but there's this idea that what licenses this operation is, or sorry, what licenses the act of analogy is the common structure of sort of capturing something, or a common operation of capturing something. Both the angler and the sophist capture things in various ways, and so it's this operation of capturing that licenses the analogy from one to the other. And so there's no particular property of the sophist or of the angler that makes this analogy valid. It's only the operations that they perform. So I think that's what he's sort of getting at here. And so he's specifically talking about intrinsic qualities of these entities. So it's only by setting the entity into a context in which it has it can perform operations, or you can look at the operations that entity performs. It's only then that you can perform an analogy or an analogical act between those two entities. So if you just sort of isolate the angler and look at what properties the angler has intrinsically, and without looking at the operations that the angler performs on fish, for example, then you can't grasp the being of the sophist using the analogy of the being of the angler, because there's no sort of shared properties that account for their the being of one in terms of the being of the other. So I think that's sort of the argument here. It has to do specifically with intrinsic qualities of the two entities in question.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can see how that line should be read in light of the next few lines.
So let's go on to the next bit. If someone else would like to read from Plato Consequently Discovered.
I can do it. Plato, right?
Yeah, from there.
Yeah, Plato consequently discovered a way to rationalize becoming, which after having been the object of Ionian physiological theories had been abandoned to the domain of deceptive knowledge by the Allagmatics, those theoreticians of the immutable and of non-temporal being. The analogical method supposes that one can know by defining structures based on the operations that dynamize them, instead of knowing by defining operations based on the structures between which they are carried out. The logical condition of the exercise of analogy supposes an ontological condition of the rapport between the structure and the operation. For the transfer of logical operation by which a being is thought, parenthesis, from one being to an analogous being, parenthesis, close. No longer use unless the logical operation was modulated by the systematic ensemble of essential operations that constitute the being. If it were a simple transfer of modalities of thought by which one contemplates a being, the analogy to another being would be merely an association of ideas. Analogy becomes logical only if the transfer of a logical operation is transfer of an operation that reproduces the operative schema of the known being. The analogy between two beings by means of thought is not legitimate unless the thought maintains an analogical rapport with the operative schema of each of the represented beings. Before the knowledge of the analogical rapport between two beings may be established, the knowledge of being must already be an analogical rapport between the essential operations of this being and the operations of thought that knows it. What thought transfers is the knowledge of an operative schematism, and this knowledge of schematism is itself a schematism that consists in operations of thought. Analogical thought establishes a relation between two terms because thought is mediation between two terms with which separately it has an immediate rapport. This mediation consists of two isolated mediations. Thought becomes the operative metasu of beings without ontological rapport, since they are not part of the same natural system of existence. Continue or stop?
Yeah, you can continue. Thanks.
One question about the parenthesis. When I read the part in between the parentheses, should I say parenthesis and a close parenthesis or something like that?
I don't think that's necessary. I think you can just read
I can just continue to read, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It should therefore be noted that analogical thought is a thought that arises from the identities of rapport, not from the reports of identity, but it must be specified these identities of reports are identities of operative reports, not identities of structure reports. This is how the opposition between analogy and resemblance is revealed. Resemblance consists of structure reports. Pseudo-scientific thought mainly utilizes resemblance and sometimes even the resemblance of vocabulary, but it does not make use of analogy. Consequently, pseudo-scientific thought formulates a veritable profusion of images and keywords. Wave, radiation. These words only cover over confused images that can barely guarantee an effective resemblance between the propagation of mechanical shock and a fluid that of an electromagnetic field without physical support. Only recently have we been able to note the confusion between two neighboring consonances, that of servo mechanism is that of the brain, in the sense that the brain can be called the center of autopiloting or self-regulation. The meaning of the slave and the meaning of the control panel are mixed together in the effective resemblance of everything on the cybernetic order, including the use of relays and vacuum tubes or thyrotrons. Conversely, the use of analogy begins with the science. Thus, Fresnel actually utilizes the analogical method when he defined the rules of the propagation of light. Insofar as one wanted to conceive the resemblance between the propagation of light and the propagation of sound, one became paralyzed by the resemblance between the light wave and the sound wave. If a structure identity between the light wave and the sound wave is supposed, one is forced to arrange the elongation of sonic vibrations and of luminous waves in an identical fashion. On the contrary, Fresnel's genius consists in abandoning resemblance for analogy, supposing a different structure of the light wave and the sound wave. He represents the light wave as having an elongation perpendicular to the direction of the propagation, and leaves to the sound wave its longitudinal elongation parallel to the direction of the displacement. From then on, analogy appears. Between these different structure terms, the operations are the same. The combination of waves, whether they be light or sound, occurs in the same way in the case sound waves as in that of light waves. The certain structure results are different, namely those where the structure characteristic of elongation intervenes with respect to the direction of displacement. The structure results are the same when the structure difference does not intervene. The phenomenon of diffraction is different, but that of stationary waves is identical. Stop here, right?
Yeah, that's a good place to stop. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a few different things going on in this bit. Maybe it was one thing that I'll point out is not exactly a translation issue, but it would have been helpful to have a note here. So right at the bottom of 666 to 667, where he talks about, he says, only recently have we been able to note the confusion between two neighboring consonants, that of servo mechanism and that of the brain. So here, he's pointing out a similarity in the French words, which doesn't exist in English, unfortunately. So servo mechanism is cerveau mécanisme, and then brain in French is cerveau. So there's a resemblance between cerveau mécanisme and cerveau, but the resemblance is completely accidental. There's no sort of conceptual connection between the two. And so that's what Simondon was pointing out here. So it doesn't really come across in English because there's no resemblance between the words in English. So that's what that bit is about. And he uses this example as an instance of pseudoscientific thought, or of not yet scientific thought, that it focuses on resemblances between, well, in this case, just resemblances between words, but in general focuses on resemblances between entities or different types of entities, as opposed to looking at analogies between different structural domains. And so then the other example that he talks about is the relationship between sound waves and light waves. And so the sort of pseudo-scientific or not quite scientific approach to understanding light waves in terms of sound waves was to see them as similar to each other or resembling each other. So light waves, or light, is to be understood as consisting of waves that are similar to sound waves. And this leads to certain problems, which Fresnel resolved by proposing that light waves have a transverse direction of propagation. So whereas sound waves, the waves are parallel to the direction of propagation. So we can think of a wave, like if you think of your sort of standard sine wave form, the wave structure is in the same direction as the actual propagation of the sound wave. Whereas light waves, as Fresnel had proposed, are the wave structure is perpendicular to the direction of propagation. So this is a difference there. There's a non-resemblance between sound waves and light waves, but this allows us to pass, once you posit this difference, or once you recognize this difference, it allows you to pass from the realm of resemblance to the realm of analogy. And so now you actually have a real grasp of the phenomenon of light waves in a way that you only had a sort of vague, a vague apprehension of before.
One difficulty I had with this section is that it seems like there are modes of knowing the world that are the comparison of structures, which is basically how he defines resemblance, identities of structural rapport. For instance, like a map, which involves a structural rapport between the elements of the map and the elements of the territory that it maps, or, like models of knowledge that are similar to maps, like images of a nebula from the Hubble Space Telescope, for instance. And then relatedly, I guess it seems like there are also, it seems like this Allagmatics piece is Simondon's, it seems to me like it's as close as he gets to talking about his epistemology. But in light of that, this book that I'm reading on scientific perspectivism, which goes into great detail on various similarities between scientific models in the world, it seems like the way in which many of these models are made is not analogical, in the sense that it doesn't follow sort of the genesis or the functioning of the object to be known with a sort of parallel process in the mode of knowing. I guess the process in the mode of recording in the instrument and the process of the genesis of the object or the functioning of the object are extremely different. And I don't think that this analogical comparison of operations would necessarily capture those methods of obtaining knowledge. I don't know if there is like an answer to those issues, but they're just things that I was thinking about when reading through this again.
Yeah, I think the map example is an interesting one, because So yeah, at some level, of course, there is a resemblance between a map and the territory that it maps, and that's sort of what it what makes a map good. And if the map doesn't resemble the territory, then you would say there's a mistake in the map. But there's also maybe at a more precise or a more I don't know what word to use here, but like a more difficult level. There's a sort of the resemblance is a sort of secondary effect, I think, because for one thing, of course, the map is two-dimensional, whereas the world that you're mapping is three-dimensional. So there's already a big um, sort of difference between the two. And then that fact, the reduction of dimension brings about a whole series of problems in cartography related to the projection, how you take a spherical body
Right.
and turn it into a flat map. There's all kinds of mathematical problems that brings up, and you have to sort of make a decision about what properties you want to preserve. So you can so some of the earlier maps use the Mercator projection, which preserves angles, and so this is useful if you're navigating a ship. You can look at the map and measure the angle between a line that goes to port A and a line that goes to port B, and you can use that angle to direct your ship to one of those ports. And But what the Mercator projection does not preserve is areas, and so this is sort of famously the case that it makes the northern hemisphere much bigger than, it makes the polar regions and regions closer to the poles bigger than regions closer to the equator. So if you look at a Mercator projection, it makes Greenland like almost the same size as Africa, whereas Africa is actually much bigger than Greenland. And so you have other projections that do preserve area, but they don't preserve angle. So the sort of resemblance is I think a secondary effect of preserving certain operations. So if you're preserving angles, you're preserving directions of navigation. If you're preserving areas, you're preserving I don't know, like land use or something like that. Like you have to make a decision about which aspects of the surface of the Earth you want to capture in your map, and you necessarily have to sacrifice certain other aspects. So I think this relationship between the aspects that you capture and the ones that you lose, I think, is probably closer to what Simondon has in mind when he's talking about analogy than it is to a resemblance. And then to the extent that there is a resemblance between a map and the territory, I think that resemblance is probably a secondary effect of the analogy of capturing angles or preserving angles or whichever property it is that you want to capture.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, the book I'm reading also talks about the map problem. But I am having trouble seeing the sort of the structural dissymmetry as being kind of compensated by like an operational symmetry. Like I see how like you would use the map to navigate if you use the Mercator projection, but it seems like he's saying that it's not like just a sort of consideration of how the knowledge is going to be used, but an actual sort of operational symmetry between the known object and then the model or the representation of the object, or what is being the unknown object that the original operation is being used to clarify.
Yeah, I think here maybe we can think about how he introduces he goes through this pretty quickly and not in maybe as much detail as we might like, but he talks about how the analogy between two objects is only possible, two entities outside of my thought is only possible because the relationship between my thought and each of those objects is itself analogical. I grasp the structure, or I shouldn't say structure, the makeup, I guess, of an entity. The way that it the being of an entity, I grasp it by using some sort of analogical relation between my own thought and the operations of my thought and the operations that make up that entity and the structures of that entity. So in the case of the mapping operation, there we have the globe with all its continents and islands and so on, is an entity outside of me that I want to gain some knowledge of, and to do that, I have to perform all sorts of operations of measuring and determining angles and areas and so on, inside my thought, or in my thought plus instruments. I have to perform all sorts of intellectual operations to grasp the entity that I'm interested in, and so it's in that sense that there's a sort of analogical grasp of the being of the entity that I'm interested in, and so it's this analogical grasp of the being of that entity that serves as sort of the basis for the way that I can then use my knowledge, or someone else can come along and look at the map that I've made, using my analogical operations of thought. They can take that map and use it to gain knowledge about the structure of the globe, and so it's only because I started from an analogical grasp of the entity of the Earth, that someone else can use the product of my thought, the map that I've drawn, to gain knowledge about the Earth, by using another analogical act. Yeah, I think it's that sort of fundamental analogical relationship between thought and the object of thought that is allowing for us to treat the act of analogy as a legitimate form of inference here.
Can I ask a question? It's like,
yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. The very first one is like rapport and the schema. So the part I read, the first part is analogical rapport with the operative schema of each of representative beings, such and such. The rapport comes a lot here. As far as I understand, for me, it sounds like a relation, rapport here, because like something different makes some kind of relation here. That's what that's kind of question. And schema here for me, it's more like information. Like, can I think that way? That's the first question. And the second question is like, if you go down a little bit, you can see the operative metathu, something like that, of beings. So this mediation consists of two isolated mediations to thought to become the operative metathu of beings without ontological rapport. So is it some kind of product like ontogenesis, or a product of this kind of all the mechanism, things like that? So I would like to know the nature or identity of metathu here. And then third one is like, while you are talking about the analogy and resemblance with the map and territory, I thought of like a biological terms like analogous organ and homologous organ. So like regarding function and the structure or shape, we can think of the biological and analogous organ is more like the origin is different, but the shape is the same, like the wings, something like that, right? And then on the other hand, like homologous organ, as you know, like the origin is the same, but the it looks different, something like that. So just reading like Fresnel's the theory idea about the light wave and the sound wave, I thought that difference between like the difference of how to function. So I thought of that one. Is it kind of proper thinking? Like when I read that one, thinking about the biological ideas that way.
Yeah, I think that's a good example, actually. But the trick here is that what in biology we call analogous organs are what Simondon is going to call a resemblance, and then homology between organs is what Simondon calls analogy. So that's sort of a tricky point of terminology. But yes, so for those who may not be familiar with that distinction, so as Ollie mentioned, like wings would be analogous organs between, say, a bird and a bat. So they, a bird and a bat have similar structures in their body, namely wings, and they both serve the function of bringing about flight. So they resemble each other. But if you look at the sort of more detail or like a closer look at the structure, they're actually not that close to each other in terms of the types of bones in a bat's wing are not similar to the type of bones in a bird's wing, for example. And so the reason for this is because the evolutionary history is completely different. A bat's wing actually corresponds to a human hand, and it's as if the skin sort of grew between all the fingers of a human hand, and that's what a bat's wing looks like. Whereas a bird's wing corresponds to the human arm, and so this relationship between organs is what's called homology. So you look at not what the organs look like now, but what sort of evolutionary history they have. And so a bird's wing and a human arm, even though they look very different and they have very different functions in terms of the life of these organisms now, they have a common evolutionary origin. So you can look at each of the bones in a human arm, and you can sort of map it onto bones in a bird's wing. So this relation of homology is closer to what Simondon is calling analogy here, whereas the analogical relationship is closer to what he's calling resemblance.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
And then also, so you brought up this bit about mediation and the mitaxu. I think that's again another point where Simondon just sort of introduces these concepts and doesn't really go into any detail about how we're supposed to understand them. But so mediation is a term that he doesn't use a lot in Volume 1, to my recollection. But I think we can see it as sort of one of the key principles of his thought, in the sense that we've talked about this before, how he always, whenever there's a sort of conceptual opposition between two terms, body and mind, for example, he always wants to find a middle point out of which those two terms can be seen to arise through a process of ontogenesis. And I think we can see this as a kind of mediation. So we grasp body and mind, or form and matter, or whichever pair of terms, we grasp them not by sort of an immediate acquaintance with them, but through the mediation of this ontogenetic process. And so I think that notion of mediation that he uses here, even though it's not a term that comes up a lot in Volume 1, I think it's a concept that we can see operating in a number of different points in that text. And so, the mitaxu here is, so the actual sort of literal meaning of mitaxu is between. So it's the between. So it's something that is between two other entities. And here, what he's talking about is how analogical thought, in particular, operates as a mediation between two entities, like the angler and the sophist. So there might not be any sort of intrinsic resemblance between the angler and the sophist. So if you look at the angler's properties and the sophist's properties, there might not be anything that they share, besides the sort of general properties of being a human or something like that. But it's through the act of analogy that you mediate between one and the other, or you use one to understand the other. And so it's in this sense that analogical thought is the mitaxu, the between, that mediates between the angler and the sophist, or between the known entity and the unknown entity.
Oh, thank you. That helps a lot. Thank you.
Okay. So let's go on to the next bit. 61, do you have a mic today, or do you want to read? Or if not, I can read. Oh.
Hey, sorry. I'm kind of half what page? Let me switch.
So we are on page 667. We're at such as the legitimacy.
20 seconds.
Yeah, sure. Or if you want, I can read this bit and then you can read the next one.
No, I got it. Just give me.
Sure.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
And we're at.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, no coffee yet today. Such is the legitimacy of the analogical method. Yet every theory of knowledge supposes a theory of being. The analogical method is valid if it concerns a world where beings are defined by their operations and not by their structures, by what they do and not by what they are. If a being is what it does, if it is not independent from what it does, the analogical method can be applied without reservation. Conversely, if a being is defined by its structure and by its operations equally, analogical thought cannot fully access the being's reality. Ultimately, if structure is what is primordial and not operation, then the analogical method loses its profound meaning and can only play a pedagogical or heuristic role. The first question of the theory of knowledge is therefore metaphysical. What is the relation of operation and of structure in being? If the answer is structure, we end up with the phenomenalist objectivism of Kant and Comte. Auguste Comte, it's not Comte, but that's the only way I can say it, and it doesn't sound like Kant. Sorry, just Comte, right? It's Kant and Comte. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Knowledge then necessarily remains relative and becomes indefinitely extensible through scientific progress. On the contrary, if the answer is operation, not structure, we end up with a dynamic intuitionism of Bergson. Knowledge is absolute and immediate, but does not necessarily reach all objects. The inert term, like matter, can only be known as a degradation of vital dynamism, and the knowledge of the static is an intuition that degrades and disintegrates. Furthermore, if the dynamic term can be an object of intuition, the very ruptures or limits of this dynamism are difficult to know through intuition. Paradoxically, science becomes the pure pragmatism of knowledge, a recipe for acting. This method partially negates itself because, starting with a primacy of operation, it can no longer recognize the operative value of scientific knowledge, or instead makes use of its operative destiny to brand knowledge as utilitarian. However, utility characterizes an operative congruence. Beginning with pragmatism, Bergson sublimated this operative inspiration of the theory of knowledge in order to privilege a pure operation, i.e., disinterested contemplative intuition, metaphysical intuition. Having introduced dualism into the very world of the operation, by distinguishing between utilitarian operation and disinterested contemplative operation, this spirituality, rediscovered in a disinterested operation, turns back towards the materiality of the interested operation in order to judge it, condemn it, and reduce it to an inferior type of slavery. However, just like the invasion of positivist rationalism by principles that are irreducible to phenomenal laws, such as thermodynamics defines them or biology utilizes them, thereby leading to the conception of the existence of two types of structure of unequal value, second principle of thermodynamics, or Claude Bernard's principle of the organizing idea, i.e., the hierarchizing structure and the structure term of the law relation. In Bergsonian knowledge, this dialectic of the separation of two forms of intuition reveals the impossibility of absolutely privileging the structure or the operation. An epistemological monism of structure or operation does not remain true to itself and recreates over the course of its development the term that it had initially excluded. Structural positivism reintroduces the notion of hierarchy, whether vital or energetic, and thus reintroduces a pure dynamism independent of all structure, since it produces structure. Bergsonian intuitionism distinguishes the pure operation, philosophical intuition, from interested materializing, spatializing, and utilitarian thought, i.e., thought attached to artificial or natural structures. Vulgar knowledge is a search for the identical throughout the endless fluidity of becoming, a refusal of movement on behalf of the static. To act, to operate, becomes synonymous with spatializing, immobilizing, structuring. Utilitarian perception abstracts and conceptualizes. The operative dynamism of life produces a systematics of immobility. Via dynamism, structure is reintroduced into knowledge as a dishonored, dismissed, and second-class intuition. The aristocratism of pure intuition can do nothing against this formation of a lower class. The former can only scorn the latter, neither nullifying nor even replacing it. The aristocratism of pure intuition cannot resolve the social problem of knowledge, and it cannot even pose this problem. In the same way, it consequently cannot discover the legitimate usage of the analogical method. It remains the deployment of metaphor, which presents itself as expression but not as definition.
Right. There's a lot going on in this bit, and yeah. So I think we here again have, as Angus has pointed out in the chat, we have some hesitation or tension on Simondon's part in terms of the domain of validity of analogical thinking. So we, throughout Volume 1, we saw that he takes analogy to be one of the sort of central principles of his philosophical method, but he also here he recognizes that analogy would only be sort of universally valid or extend to all of being if we could treat being as coextensive with action or with operation. So it's only if operation exhausts being, or if there's nothing more to being than operation, that you can use analogy to grasp every element of being or every aspect of being. And on the other hand, if there is some aspect of reality that is not operation or that is not doesn't fall under the concept of operation, then we end up with something that analogy can't grasp. And he gives here a pretty dense but I think very interesting argument about what connection there is between operation and structure in terms of in our theory of knowledge. So we want to know first whether there is something that is not operation, so something that would not be graspable by the analogical method. And then if there is, then what is the relationship between that structure and that operation? And then, so the two possible answers would be first that the relation between structure and operation is itself a structure. It's something that can be sort of grasped in terms of composition of entities or the makeup of entities. And Simondon, in a pretty quick way here, he identifies this with Kantian and Comtean phenomenalism. He goes into more detail about this argument in one of the texts in on philosophy. But the idea here is that in these sort of theories of knowledge, we only ever grasp appearances. We only have knowledge of appearances, and we don't have knowledge of things as they are in themselves. And so knowledge is relative, but it's indefinitely extensible in the sense that we can always have more and more knowledge of appearances. We can have better scientific grasp of the appearances. But yeah, so this is the phenomenalist objectivism. This is the one side where you start from treating the relationship between structure and operation as itself a structure. Then the other side is if you say that the relationship between operation and structure is an operation. And so he identifies this with Bergson's what he calls dynamic intuitionism. So for Bergson, we have this intuitive knowledge, or we have this intuitive access to duration, and it's only in a sort of secondary sense that we have access to structure, to objects and the makeup of the layout of objects in space, for example. Yeah, so here he goes through again in a pretty dense way what he sees as the limit of about Bergson, or the sort of dynamic intuitionism, in the sense that for Bergson, the scientific knowledge itself ends up becoming something that is not really graspable. Scientific knowledge is sort of reduced for Bergson to a knowledge of structures, which is something that is sort of inherently unattainable. It's if our knowledge is always or is essentially or primarily this intuitive access to duration, then having a knowledge of structures is something that can only be a sort of second-class knowledge or not really knowledge. So Bergson has these instances where he sort of compares the scientific depiction of entities in space with he takes this to be a sort of pragmatic kind of knowledge. So we want to know, where entities are located, basically, so that we can find them and use them for our own purposes. Whereas the intuition of duration is something that is not utilitarian in that sense. So it's something that we have this sort of contemplative or purely theoretical, I guess, attitude towards, in the sense that we grasp duration not with the goal of achieving a certain end, but for the sake of for its own sake, essentially. And so this opposition between like the true knowledge or the contemplative knowledge or the sort of first class knowledge of duration, and then the second class knowledge or the not quite knowledge or utilitarian sort of knowledge of the layout of objects in space. This opposition, Simondon argues here, is a kind of limit point of this dynamical intuitionism in Bergson. So it's a kind of impossibility for Bergson to grasp both kinds of knowledge or both realms of knowledge as having equal value, or as to put it another way, the operation, this operation or this grasp of operation itself leaves behind a kind of residue that is the structure, the grasp of structure. And so it's in this sense that Simondon sees this dynamical intuitionism as being, in a sense, self-undermining. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. I know, Angus, you have to leave pretty soon, but I think we can try to finish this text, and we only have about a page or page and a half left, so let's push through and then pick up from next time.
That sounds great. I will catch up on the recording. Thanks, Nan. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks. See you. Okay, so I will read the next page. The duty of allagmatic epistemology is to determine the veritable relation between structure and operation in being, and therefore to organize the rigorous and legitimate rapport between the structural knowledge and operative knowledge of a being, between analytical science and analogical science. Structural analytical science supposes that a whole is reducible to the sum of its parts or to the combination of its elements. Analogical science, on the contrary, supposes that the whole is primordial and expresses itself through its operation, which is a holistic functioning. Analogical science establishes equivalences between operations, i.e. holistic functionings. To wonder what the being is to wonder how the functioning, the holistic schematism of a being, and the structure, the analytical systematic of this being, articulate themselves. Chronological schematism and the spatial systematic are organized together in the being. Their union creates individuality insofar as the individual is a domain of reciprocal convertibility of operation into structure and of structure into operation. The individual is the unity of the being grasped prior to any distinction or opposition of operation and structure. The individual is that in which an operation can be reconverted into a structure and the structure into an operation. It is the being prior to any knowledge or any action. It is the milieu of the allagmatic act. Allagmatic theory is the study of the individual being. It organizes and defines the relation of the theory of operations, applied cybernetics, and the theory of structures, analytical and deterministic science. Allagmatic theory has a place in the theory of knowledge as well as in the theory of values. It is axiontological, for it grasps the reciprocity of axiological dynamism and of ontological structures. It grasps the being not outside space and time, but prior to the division into spatial systematic and temporal schematism. The knowledge of the relation between operation and structure is established by a mediation between the temporal schematism and the spatial systematic in the individual. This mediation, this mutual condition, this reality not yet deployed into schematism and systematic, into operation and structure, can be called internal tension, supersaturation, or incompatibility. The individual is tension, supersaturation, incompatibility. This tension, supersaturation, and incompatibility develops into operation and structure. into the operation of a structure, such that we must always consider the operation structure coupled that is allagmatically equivalent to the tension, supersaturation, and incompatibility of an individual. There are two states of the individual: the unified syncretic state, i.e. the state of tension, and the analytic state, i.e. the state of distinction between operation and structure. The act is the change of the individual state. Okay, let's stop here because this is all fairly dense. 61 has posted a nice chart about the operation of structure, or the relation of operation and structure in being. Did you make this, 61?
Yeah, I just made this a second ago.
Oh yeah, okay, that's very helpful. It's just a nice sort of overview of what the distinction is between the two. So as we might expect from Simondon, he wants to overcome the opposition between the phenomenalist objectivism of Kant and Comte and the dynamic intuitionism of Bergson. So he wants to overcome this opposition between the one answer to the question of what the relation is between operation and structure, that says it's a structure, and then the other answer that says the relation between operation and structure is an operation. So he wants to get beyond this opposition and grasp something that is neither structure nor operation, that is sort of prior to the separation between structure and operation, and that out of which structure and operation will be developed. And so again, I think we can point back to his analysis of the cogito earlier in this text as being this sort of immediate reciprocity of structure and operation. So I think it's that type of I don't know, I want to call it an act, but it's a kind of act and structure, is an operation and structure at the same time. It's immediately one and the other. So it's this kind of thought that is prior to the opposition between structure and operation that he wants us to take as the most fundamental. And here we see he sort of brings us back to the notion of the individual that he sort of stepped away from at the beginning of the text. And so this is sort of what I was describing earlier in terms of the strategy of like ascending to the more abstract level to redescend to the more concrete level and sort of try to reframe our understanding of the concrete in terms of that more abstract level that we ascended to earlier. So allagmatic theory is the study of the individual being. So it's a study of the convertibility of operation and structure between each other. So it's only insofar as there's only an individual, or an entity is only an individual insofar as you can grasp it in terms of this level of reality or level of thought that is prior to structure and operation. And so this is sort of the fundamental level at which allagmatic thought operates. It's where being is understood as this immediate convertibility of structure and operation. And so this is where allagmatics, or the theory of allagmatics, sort of links up to the whole account of individuation in volume 1 of the book. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. So if someone else could pick up from there are two parts to allagmatics, and then read to the end of the text. Ollie, I think it's your turn if you're ready.
Yeah, I can do it. There are two parts of allagmatics. 1, the theory of passage from the syncretic state to the analytic state. 2, the theory of passage from the analytic state to the syncretic state. Every act of the first type is equivalent to an act of a second type. The first type of act can be called crystallization, and the second type can be called modulation. We will hold as a postulate that every crystallization is equivalent to an inverted modulation, and vice versa. Starting with the syncretic individuality, crystallization is the act that transforms the latter into an analytic individuality, which consists of a spatial structure, topology of interiority, exteriority, birth of a limit, organized and homogeneous form, the milieu that has become amorphous, stable, heterogeneity, guaranteed by the topological limit, and of an operative function that reveals itself as an activity organized by an energetic temporal schematism. crystallization replaces the syncretic state of the individuating individual with the analytic state of the individuated individual, which is characterized in particular by the mutual authority of the structural form and of the material milieu in which the latter exists. Conversely, modulation fuses the synthesis of structure and operation by organizing a temporal operation according to a morphological structure. The force of an operation is informed here by a signal form that guides this force. Every demodulation is the analysis of this syncretic complex of form and force. Every demodulation of detection separating the form from the force that it informs is a crystallization. Demodulation can only occur if the condition of tension, supersaturation, and incompatibility is fulfilled. If not, the modulated force remains an individuating individual without ever being analyzed into structure and operation. Continue? Continue?
Yes, to
yeah.
the end of this.
All
Yeah,
right,
thanks.
all right. So there are a certain number of intuitions at the basis of every theory. He will reflect on the two domains within which the two basic intuitions, whose symmetry we are portraying, originate. The first is physical chemistry, with a study of the conditions of the synthesis of crystals, supersaturated or supercooled solutions, and the study of epitaxy. The second is information theory, and in particular, the theory of the relation between the signal, the power supply, and the structure of the modulator in the different types of modulators that the techniques of transmission theoretically studies. The latter study involves its reciprocal, i.e., the theory of demodulation, which is also called detection, provided that one understands by this term not just a rectifier applied to modulated alternating current, but also the set of selective filtrations due to which the modulating form or forms are separated from the modulated energy and are rediscovered in the state of pure signal. After having contemplated the simple modulator, the study will have to describe the complex modulator, or intermodulator, in which the power supply has already received a preliminary modulation and then receives a second modulation. We will also have to describe the complex demodulator, in which several successive detections are effectuated. As far as the energetic residue of previous demodulation takes on the value of modulated energy for the next demodulation. At the end of this twofold study, the philosophical notion of causality will be enriched, and the notion of the individual will be defined. Then we will need to specify the way the act of crystallization and the act of modulation are linked in the becoming of physical, biological, psychological, social systems. This will be the role of allagmatic hypothesis concerning the nature of becoming. Wow, important ideas are bombarded here. Important ideas are bombarded here.
Yeah, it's just like basically a program for all of philosophy. Yeah, not much. Yeah, so again, there's a lot going on in this, page or so that we just read. So he talks about the first he talks about the syncretic state and the analytic state. So syncretic state is the state before the distinction between operation and structure, and then analytic state is the state after that distinction between operation and structure is realized. And so he's going to say that, or he's going to posit as his use of these terms. He's going to say that every passage from a syncretic state to an analytic state is a crystallization. A crystallization, and then every passage from an analytic state to a syncretic state is a modulation. And he postulates here that these two processes are inverse of each other. So you can sort of do one and then do the other and return to where you started. So crystallization would be starting with so in the sort of physical sense, the actual physical process of crystallization, you start with the supersaturated solution, and then and so this is a sort of amorphous substance, and then out of this amorphous substance, you get something in which you have an opposition between structure and operation. So you have a crystal, which is a structure, and then you have the growth of the crystal, which is its operation. So here we have he also he uses the terms here individuating individual and individuated individual. So here again, we should be thinking of the passage in volume 1 where he talks about doubting doubt and doubted doubt. And then we should also be thinking of the Spinozistic distinction between natura naturata and natura naturans. So we have this distinction between individuating individual. So this is the syncretic state of the individual, and then the individuated individual, which is the analytic state. He just sort of introduces these terms kind of in passing here, but I think those terms are very important. That ing ed distinction is very important for his thought. And then we have let's see what else. Yeah, so then he talks about the sort of basis of this theory in physical chemistry and information theory as the two sides, or the two physical sciences, or the two sciences in general, that he takes as his sort of starting points out of which he's making this analogy with other aspects of being. And then he gives us this sort of, in a couple paragraphs, he gives us this huge project, which I think we can, to some extent, say was realized in individuation, of using this kind of schema of the syncretic to analytic and the analytic to syncretic transformations as a kind of schema for understanding individuation in all sorts of different domains: physical, vital, psychical, and social. So no questions or comments about that last bit?
No, I'm always just super overwhelmed by everything that I'm just saying. So I'm trying to soak in as much as I'm able to.
Yeah, this is a text that I think you have to read multiple times, because each paragraph has like 20 new ideas introduced, and so there's like so much going on in every line of this text. It's I think it's one of his more difficult and dense texts, but it's a very rich text as well, I think.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I also need like a time to digest. It's like a full of like a rich food, like really nice actually.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. So yeah, maybe we can take some time to digest, and then we can talk about it a little bit more next week. And I think, if I am not mistaken, I think the texts are in a different order. So yeah, we still have form, information, and potentials to go through. So we actually, I can't remember if either or both of you were there when we did this, but we actually read this text like, I don't know exactly how long, over a year ago, when we started reading Individuation, or just before we started Individuation.
Yeah, I kind of remember this, I think.
Yeah, so it was translated separately, and it also had the discussion section after. So this was a talk that Simondon gave at the French Society for Philosophy, and they always published like the actual communication, the talk itself, and then the discussion afterwards. So the one we read had both the text and the discussion, but this one just has the text. But I think it would be useful to come back to this text after having read the whole book, and have like a different sort of appreciation of the text itself.
This
Okay.
is the one with the discussion, I think, that I posted. I believe this
Right.
is the discussion
Yeah.
part.
Okay. So thanks for coming out. We can talk about the thoughts about Allagmatics next time as well, and then we can go on to form, information, potentials, which will probably take a couple weeks to get through.